It's the week-ending Saturday, the 5th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Trump continuing to fire as many people as when he was on The Apprentice, prison governors attacking the government over poor conditions, and British Airways hit by more IT problems causing havoc for holidaymakers. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team this week are Rebecca Gillie, Felicity, Capon and Ashley Wassall. And starting the show this week, it's Ashley. What do you think this week is going to be remembered for?
Well, unsurprisingly, on the internet, sometimes things aren't as they seem.
Mia Ash is being used to troll for connections in the oil and gas industries. The operation's goal is to infect the marks with puppy rat malware in a cyber espionage play. So if you're bored out there on your production platform, sorry to rain on your parade, petroleum engineers, but Mia's not really interested in you because, well, there's no Mia.
That was a clip from the Cyberwire podcast. If you have no idea of what any of that meant, you're not alone, but Ashley is here to decode it. Ashley, who or what is Mia?
So Mia Ash is apparently a confection of the Iranian government who has been created in order to ensnare middle-aged men who are at the top of particularly the oil and gas industry, but other industries as well. And it's effectively the classic corporate espionage honey trap.
Right. So created in the form of what?
So it's a persona. It's a Facebook persona. It's a catfish, if you know the term. It's a personality that exists only online for the purposes of making someone believe that in this case, a middle-aged man believes that this young lady is interested in them, so that they will give them access to their accounts, add them to their accounts, and also divulge secrets whilst also declaring their undying love.
Okay, that was very succinct, but I wanted more. I love the detail of this. So let's just talk through this. This was essentially, this is a beautiful Romanian woman in her kind of late 20s who looked like an artsy photographer.
Yeah,
and had a very convincing like LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook profile. And she, in inverted commas because she didn't exist, spoke to these executives she was trying to target for sometimes months before asking the killer question, which was, can you fill in a survey for me using an Excel spreadsheet, but it'll only open on your work computer? At which point you should think, well, that doesn't sound like flirtation. But these guys did open the file and then get a nasty virus on their computer, and that's how this scam runs.
Yeah, it was sort of a very convoluted but classic phishing scam. I don't know if you've ever seen the MTV show Catfish as well, but this is the classic ignoring of red flags that goes on when someone's infatuated with a virtual presence. Is, very clearly this person's not real, or there's certainly signs you should be picking up on, but I've been talking to them for 3 years online and I love them, so why would I look into that in any way?
Yeah, and Rebecca, in internet terms, this is phishing, as Ashley says with a PH. But actually, in old-fashioned terms, it's a honey trap, isn't it? It's straightforwardly, let's target middle-aged men. How? Let's pretend a young, beautiful woman is interested in them.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been, the weak spot of a lot of institutions is, male folly, especially men of a certain age. I mean, it's been it's been a standby of espionage for ever since there was espionage, sending in the beautiful woman to seduce the vulnerable man who's flattered by the attention. And it does go to show that sometimes the old scams are the best scams. I mean, using modern technology, obviously it's a lot easier. You don't have to convince some woman to dress up and do a kind of pussy galore type routine. But it's the exact same principle, that people are just vulnerable to the flattery of thinking that someone's romantically interested in them and will be incredibly stupid.
And that's really why I've brought the clip. For years, I think we've been conditioned, we've been told that the internet is changing everything. It's changing fundamentally something about our behaviour or our attitudes. And actually, it's not. It's making things easier, it's making things quicker, but ultimately, middle-aged men are always going to be attracted to apparently younger women who are showing an interest. This is how corporate espionage has been done since the dawn of time.
Which raises the question, Felicity, should middle-aged men be put in charge of so many organisations in the first place?
No. I think what's interesting is that, if anything, it seems that technology might be exacerbating the problem, because actually your vulnerabilities and your weaknesses might be more exposed online. And I think particularly, I'm thinking of sort of soldiers who might be incredibly bored or lonely, who might be approached by a honey trap. I think online you feel more uninhibited, that you would start a conversation, you would start divulging your secrets and your deepest
and it's
passions.
also-
So if anything, it's making that very time-old problem even worse, I think.
Yeah, and it's
probably.
also it's incredibly easy to learn about your targets online. Now everyone has such an expansive online presence. You can definitely get a picture of the kind of person that you're going after and kind of work out what their weak points are. And it definitely makes it a lot easier. I find it quite ironic as well, this idea that, men are so vulnerable to these, saucy foxes who want to get into their bank accounts. Like up to the 1990s, gay men weren't allowed to work in the intelligence services because there was a fear that they would be seduced by, a Soviet double agent and then blackmailed. But it turns out that it's still going on to this day with heterosexual men and probably with, gay men as well.
And women, to be fair. I'm sure there are senior women
women
who can be equally seduced, probably with a different tactic.
Yeah.
By a
well,
man
no, not necessarily. If there's
online.
anything that we learnt from the MTV show Catfish, it's that women are also incredibly vulnerable to these kinds of scams. I think it's probably more a
With
side
women,
effect of there not being as many women in these top roles. I
No.
think if there were, they'd definitely be just as vulnerable.
But there are plenty of widows out there, aren't there, for example, with bank accounts that can be raided by, young men pretending to be glamorous 45-year-old sergeants who are interested in them on dating sites. We know that goes on as well.
And is it always looks-based, is what I was wondering. There was a similar case in 2009 of a LinkedIn profile set up of ostensibly this woman called Robin Sage, and she was clad in a bikini, and she attracted all these, senior executives and high up officials who were absolutely falling over themselves to help her out. And it turned out that she didn't exist. She'd been set up by someone to see how effective it was. And there were all these red flags that, anyone could have easily looked into and found out that she wasn't real. She said she'd been working in cybersecurity for 10 years. That would have meant she'd got the job when she was 15. But I think, interestingly, the guy who created this persona in an interview, he said the reason it was so successful was this shot of her in a bikini. And he said it was 100% looks-based, which is why it was so successful. And I wonder if it's the same for both genders, whether you have a male honey trap or a female honey trap.
There is a technological solution as well, potentially, in terms of lifting this woman's photograph, because she's a fake woman, but it's a real woman whose image they used, who was a Romanian student or something. And then, as you say, Ashley, they created this fake personality for her based in London, photographer and everything else. But there should be a way that the computer algorithm can identify, oh, that's a photo of so-and-so, and actually she's from this place, that's not her, and alert her to the fact her identity has been stolen. And that could shut this down, couldn't it?
There's a couple of things. Firstly, that's actually possible. You have to do it a slightly manual way now. You can image search, but if you're of a mind to want to believe, to suspend disbelief in this case, you're probably not going to do that. Having an automated algorithm that checks these things probably isn't in some of these chaps' interest, because if they're pursuing some of these extracurricular activities online, they probably don't want computers automatically checking and vetting who they're talking to.
Perhaps some of these women are also in on it as well. They're not actively part of some kind of, they're trying to be the honey trap, and they actually have more of an agenda than we think.
Possibly, although actually, I know this sounds unlikely. My image has been used to create profiles that are nothing to do with me, which is, they weren't, as far as I could tell, honey trap profiles.
Were they honey traps?
They were mostly in Asian foreign scripts, so I couldn't work out what they said. But I think they were being used to sell dodgy computer software or something. And the only reason I ever knew about it is because people who listen to my shows, who know what I look like, forwarded them on to me and said, look what you're up to, kind of thing. But it's a very weird sensation when you know it's happening.
It's like Ash was saying, though, it just boils down to suspension of disbelief. You can ignore any red flag, even if there was an automated system that could tell you, oh, this isn't a real photo or this isn't a real profile. People will overlook it, just like they overlook red flags in their real life relationships. And it just goes to show that no matter how developed our technology becomes and how sophisticated it is, there are always going to be people behind it, and there's always going to be ways to target that human frailty.
The human weaknesses haven't changed, have they?
Except the only problem with that argument, if we're saying this is the moment where people, realise they need to be stronger against these kinds of scams, the only weakness in that argument, Ashley, is that the only reason we know about this at all is that one of the chaps who was being targeted in the Middle East, he fell for it, but actually his company, presumably some sort of security company or government agency, their internal computer systems were clever enough to notice that a virus had got into their system, and then they researched into it, and then they've released this detail as a press release. So they were able to stop it, actually, from getting into their system and leaking their details to the Iranians?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how many of these things go on all the time, though. That's the thing. I think it's your classic tip of the iceberg, and we've already mentioned another example during this discussion. There will be others as well. I think, as I say, for me, it's more the general point, I guess, that technology is not the great revolutionizer of the way we behave. It's actually just a different way of facilitating the things that people have always done.
And if we're all learning lessons, presumably you're now all going to go off and image search yourself to check that you haven't been uploaded to Chinese websites.
I Google myself on a daily basis. So.
Do you think you'd be aware of it?
No, I don't, actually.
Have you ever checked, Rebecca?
I have never checked. I don't think anyone's using my bikini photos to ensnare middle-aged men, in all honesty.
Is Facebook's privacy settings not a way of protecting against this? Because that's what I did. I just updated my privacy settings and
We're going to do
assumed, therefore, I'm now safe in perpetuity.
We're going to do this later when you go upstairs.
Ashley, you're not going to get used as a honey trap. Felicity, or the woman who claims to be Felicity, who's a glamorous journalist sitting in front of me, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
The news this week suggests tourism has reached a dangerous tipping point.
We love the tourists, and we would like everybody in the world to come in Venice to visit us.
But not all at once.
But not everybody at the same time, because Venice is a small place.
That was Matteo Secchi, a Venetian campaigner, speaking to ITV's James Mates. This is the story, Felicity, that Venice is frustrated with what they're calling low-quality tourism.
Yes.
Define that for us.
Well, I think it's these very boorish, brainless, bovine tourists that seem to have, I'm trying to think of any more B words, that seem to have just sort of swamped Venice. It's sort of, Venice is sinking under this huge tide of tourists who are descending on the city every day. I think something like 60,000 per day, roughly 20 million a year. And it's just getting to the point of the locals can't deal with it. There are growing protests, there are growing revolts. And it's completely eroding the quality of life. I think it's something like there's now 50,000 Venetians left in the city, and that's down from 175,000 in 1951.
But is there an element of snobbishness there? Because, you know,
yes.
When it comes to... Fair enough. I'll rephrase. I've located an element of snobbishness there. Because, you know, when it comes to the Biennale, no one says, oh, look at all these boorish people tramping all over our city. But there's just as many of them. It's just, you know, they've all got lots of money to spend on paintings.
That's true. I think that is absolutely correct. And I think last week the mayor introduced these fines, and the fines were very much targeting bad behaviour. Like there's a €100 fine if you take your shirt off, there's a €100 fine if you jump in the Grand Canal, that sort of thing. But I think that's fair enough. If they're targeting the badly behaved tourists who are more so eroding their quality of life than perhaps the high cultured, then I think that's, why not? Like,
low quality doesn't necessarily just refer to their behaviour as well. I know that like a lot of the problems they've been having are the fact that they have so many day trippers as well. Yeah. Which, I mean, obviously is kind of a function of the fact that a city of 50,000 people can't host 60,000 tourists, you know, to stay there overnight. But they come in, they don't really contribute to the local economy. They just tramp around, have a sandwich and an ice cream and leave again.
Exactly. And I think it's these monstrous cruise ships that are disgorging and vomiting these tourists into the city.
Do you have a problem with tourists?
Well, the more I read into this, the more I think we need to address tourism and how we go about being good tourists. I think it is to do with, are you being respectful? Are you, treating them? And also, I also think cities are for the people who live there first and foremost. I think Paris is for Parisians, and I think you have to.
But aren't we past that point in a lot of other European cities? I mean, okay, perhaps we're not quite at the stage where you'd say London isn't for Londoners, but certainly Zone 1. I mean, basically, no one lives in Leicester Square, do they? Everyone acknowledges that that's for tourists to come and go to M&M's World, and that is a valuable economic driver to the city.
Zone 1 to 4 is pretty much bereft of people who were born in Zone 1 to 4 because of house prices. Yeah. So it's rich people coming from the outside, or it's,
but that's tourists of another kind, isn't it?
There's a difference between, because the house prices is the thing in London that's driven people out of the centre, whereas, in Venice, it's such a small city already that because it's become so saturated with tourists and everything caters to tourism. When we were talking earlier about this same article that was in the, I think it was in the New York Times and you were saying about how you can't find a supermarket in the centre of
and if you want to go to your local doctor, you have to set off half an hour earlier because you'll get trapped in a huge mob of tourists. So it takes you longer to do the little things.
Is like, you can still go about your business in the centre of London even if you can't afford to live there.
But Venice is a completely impractical place to live anywhere. I mean, anywhere where you have to go about by boat. I mean, surely you've chosen to live. I mean, I get you may be a local, and you've lived there for generations, but nonetheless, you're choosing to remain in a place that isn't the most pragmatic. I mean, it's a bit like, if you live in Oxford, for example, equally, you can't go anywhere by road between 9 and 10 in the morning because all the students are on their bikes everywhere and it's a one-way system.
But how disproportionate does it have to be before it becomes a Disneyland?
I think the problem here is, though, that Venice doesn't have another industry, does it? It used to be this great trading power, this merchant trading power, and it's not anymore. Venice's industry is tourism. And Venice is going to sink, whether or not the tourists are there. We talk about them sinking under the weight of tourists. It's sinking because its foundations are rotten after all those years, because they're made out of wood. Venice will sink without great investment. And that investment is only coming through tourism. Now, the Italian culture minister talks about this eat and flee tourism, and I've done it. I've got on the coach.
Eat and flee.
Eat and flee. So the people who come in and have their lunch and go back on their coach before their cruise ship.
Eaten and fled.
I've eaten and fled in Venice, and I enjoyed myself immensely. And I think the Italian culture minister's proposal was to cap the number of tourists, was to say this is how many we can cope with. And I think that's perfectly good commercial sense. That's saying if we have too many, we're probably going to cause the very thing we're trying to stop. But if Venice is going to save itself, it needs money, and the money's going to come from tourism. They don't have London's financial centre or its tech hub or its myriad other industries. Venice has tourism.
And I think that's applicable to Barcelona or anywhere else. I think it's that finding a very fine balance between how these cities take advantage of the growth of tourism but aren't taken over by it, because tourism is the golden goose and it brings in so much money. And I also think, a lot of Venetians feel a huge sense of pride in people coming to visit their city. So it's about harnessing that in a way that is going to protect these places. And also in terms of, the recession in Italy, like tourism can really, or Hurricane Katrina, tourism can really help places that need the money. It's about finding that very tough balance, I think.
I mean, maybe, and this is a solution that has been proposed by some of these Venetian protesters, isn't it? Maybe the solution is simply ban the cruise ships, because the thing with the cruise ship is everyone comes off, they all follow someone with a flag to a square, they buy their ice cream, and then they go back on the boat for their all-you-can-eat buffet. From that point of view, they're really contributing the least to the local economy, even compared to people who day trip in on a plane.
Yeah, well, I wonder
if
they bring in so much money, though. I think the Port Authority has mounted a robust defence of the cruise ships and say actually they generate so many jobs for Venetians that I think it'd be quite tricky to do that. But I think it's more about finding palpable rewards for Venetians, and sort of could the cruise ships maybe pay for nurseries or roadworks or schools so that they can see a sort of palpable return on all these hordes.
Isn't it also as well, because I think one of the problems with the cruise ships is they block the view, don't they? It's they sort of go in front of St Mark's Square, and all the Venetians get very angry they can't see the line of sight.
I mean, the big ones are vastly out of proportion to the city.
And they're huge, and they're actually sort of frightening if you stand next to them. Yeah. But I mean, surely you could just have a rule that fixes that says, so once you've disgorged or vomited up your tourists, you must go a certain distance away into the lagoon, and then that would stop them coming back on for their lunch. And it's quite a simple rule that doesn't stop the day trippers, but just says, you can't just park in front of St Mark's Square
and also that might sort of encourage a breakaway from the very superficial way that tourists go about seeing things. I think the Uffizi Museum and Art Gallery in Florence, they are now putting up the price of single entry tickets and making it cheaper to buy a 3-day pass, because they want to encourage people to go and see the whole gallery and to take their time, rather than you get your selfie in front of Botticelli and then off you go and have some crap pizza.
I've been to the Uffizi and I spent half a day there, and I think I saw about a tenth of what was in there. It's, and I actually did try, but it's just you can't do it.
But actually, I mean, hotel rooms in Florence versus hotel rooms in Venice, is pointing towards the reason that you're more likely to be a day tripper in Venice as well, isn't it? It's not necessarily the fault of these tourists; they literally can't afford to stay there for more than one day.
But it does ask a question, like, to what extent are we entitled to tell people how to enjoy themselves? I mean, like a cap on numbers. If the city can't handle a certain number of tourists, that's one thing. But like, finding you've taken your shirt off, trying to incentivize you to spend more time in an art gallery, like, it sort of comes into that question of, can we not maybe it's too idealistic. Can we not trust people to, as a society, say, okay, we need to manage these places like such as Venice. They need to be managed sustainably. So maybe we can't all go and see them at once. Or do we have to rely on, local councils and governments imposing all of these regulations designed to kind of control the kind of herd mentality of the tourists? Like, you can go here or you can stay there for a certain amount of time, all this kind of thing.
You started that question is, can we trust people? The answer is no.
Could there be a technological solution? Was my question for everything. But regarding the fact that now when people are choosing where to go when they're on holiday, data's free within the EU, isn't it, for as long as Brexit doesn't happen? And if you go from the UK, then you can log on to TripAdvisor. It can recommend places for you to go so that perhaps over time, not all tourists will want to do exactly the same route, go to exactly the same square, eat in exactly the same cafe. And the economic benefits might just naturally be spread out across the city, actually, the more that people start telling each other where to go instead of just visiting the same three places.
I think it's going to be the opposite. I think it's going to get worse because of China. Because there's still the huge mentality of group travel, and I think that's only there's only an expanding middle class in China. So I think it may get worse before it gets better in terms of massive groups of tourists.
But for me, the sheer coverage, when you read about Venice or Barcelona, that actually now puts me off, and I wonder whether more people say, I'm not going to go to Venice anymore, because actually I don't want to be stuck in St. Mark's Square surrounded by a sea of people.
Westerner who thinks that way, there's like 500 Chinese
who would
people
rather be with the herd.
Great, let's go to Venice.
Yeah.
Yeah. My tip, just go to the Venetian in Las Vegas. It's exactly the same, and there's a branch of Pandora. And last up this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I was just wondering if anyone fancies a drink.
Hey, I'm Lee Reedy. This song's about Oasis drinks. I'm selling notes, singing this song. Your liquid loving stops it feeling wrong. I sold my soul to the marketing team, but the money's good and the Oasis drinks are free. Oasis, it's hashtag refreshing stuff. Oasis, buy a bottle 'cause it just ain't enough.
This show just gets weirder. That was Lee Reedy, winner of a recent social media competition run by the drink Oasis. You can find that song now on Audio Network. Rebecca, you want to talk about sellouts, as in the artists that take the corporate dollar. Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say this is something that has, been a particular bugbear of mine recently. However, I have been hearing that song a lot on Spotify recently. So it's become one of the, the adverts that they play on Spotify free. So, but when I looked it up, as you say, it was a social media competition. When I read the post, which Oasis posted saying, thanks everyone who said they would sell out in return for money and delicious free Oasis, etc., etc. And it did hit me that it was quite depressing. And so many of the comments were people saying, I'd sell out for Oasis, ha 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 ha, hashtag corporate, etc., etc. And then the other thing that happened this week, which was quite timely with regard to that, was there was an interview with Trent Reznor, from Nine Inch Nails. It did a long-form interview with Vulture. It's really good. And one of the things that he talked about was the death of the shocking pop star and how he was astonished from his long career in the music industry at how much young artists and music fans embrace the idea of going corporate and almost undergoing kind of patronage, the kind of sort of Renaissance era. You've got your sponsor and they fund your art. And it just got me thinking that, there has been a massive change in that respect.
So just be clear on this. The discussion point here is the era of people saying you've sold out because you're doing corporate stuff, if you're a musician, is that era over? Yeah,
and I think it ties into, we hear a lot about how the young generations now are quite small c conservative compared to their parents and even grandparents. There was an article in The Guardian last week about how generation train spotting is the most likely to die of drugs. Younger people don't do as many drugs, they don't drink as much. Generally, their attitude on life seems to be more conformist. And hand in hand with that, I think, goes this idea that you no longer expect, Sex Pistols type artists, people sticking their middle finger up at the industry. And I don't think that young people seem as keen for that kind of rebellion maybe as they did in previous generations.
I mean, isn't that just because, Ashley, there's a more sophisticated understanding amongst young people, but probably because of things like YouTube, where they have a relationship with their favourite vloggers and understand that unless there's corporate involvement, those people don't make any money. there's an understanding that, well, if I'm getting this for free, because the internet's made everything free, the only way my favourite artist will be supported is if a brand gets in touch. And actually, that's great. I get my content, they get their trainers, no problem.
I think that's absolutely true. And I also think, at the end of the day, I can't criticise it too much. I work for a website that's largely funded for advertising. So if we don't take the sponsorship dollar, then I don't get paid. It's, that's the nature of it. And I think there's always this distinction to be drawn.
You're not that rock and roll, though.
You'd be surprised. Well, probably not. I think there's a distinction to be drawn between taking the sponsorship dollar to fund your art, the patronage argument, and it's about brands, wanting to associate with a certain artist and the artist needing the money, and the degree to which that influences your content. I think I see very few examples of, that song is a potentially hilarious example, but I'm sure the Rolling Stones wouldn't have recorded that, for example, or whoever, who may have taken sponsorship money.
Well, the Who did do that album, didn't they, which was jokes about selling out.
Yeah, but that was irony, wasn't it? That was them trying to send up the whole thing. It was very
well, isn't that irony, what we just heard? I mean, I know it is paid for by Oasis, but it is still a joke about that.
Yes, that's quite postmodern because it's a joke about a joke that's sort of a joke started out as a joke. But I don't know. I get the sense that there's the idea of the sellout was always a bit of a confection anyway. Punk was just a way of selling a certain attitude to people, wasn't it? And it very quickly became commodified. The way people wore their shirts, people were buying expensive T-shirts and ripping them and then putting pins in them. This wasn't the counterculture movement at its roots. I think.
Felicity's frowning. Can we get some debate going here? Good.
I think that's really cynical.
Great.
I went to a great exhibition last year at the V&A called Records and Rebels, and it was all about counterculture between 1966 to 1970. The impression it left me with was how many artists were creating music and creating art about what they were seeing going on around them, inequalities and civil rights and Vietnam. And I just was suddenly thinking, we just do not have this today. I could not name one song or one artist which was a protest song about Brexit or Trump or politics or anything like that. And they had these amazing screens of Jimi Hendrix doing this very anti-American Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, which was, absolutely mesmerising. I've never seen anything like it. And I was going around with my mum, who was like, stop and watch this. This is an incredible piece of music history. And I just thought, God, we don't have big artists these days doing something so sort of...
But that's because the crowd aren't interested in buying it. It's not because it doesn't exist. There are plenty of protest songs on YouTube, aren't there? It's just that Rihanna is more popular.
But I think that even if...
But why? That's so sad.
So that's a different question, isn't it? Why is Rihanna more popular than protest songs? Is a different question to why shouldn't Rihanna take sponsorship from Coca-Cola?
That was actually something that came up in the Trent Reznor interview. So he was saying that where they used to push the envelope politically, and he was talking about not just Nine Inch Nails, but he was talking about things like Marilyn Manson, and how that really kind of made parents uncomfortable, incited a bit of a moral panic. Like where people used to push the envelope politically, now they push it sexually. He was talking about and he specifically mentioned the Anaconda music video by Nicki Minaj, which it's ironically over sexualized. There's lots of spurting cream and banana licking going on, but that has certainly, I think, now is our frontier, is what can be more sexual, who can wear more revealing outfits, is kind of what we talk about in terms of what's controversial.
I find that sad too. That for me doesn't compare to Jimi Hendrix writing a song about not writing a song, but making a protest against Vietnam. Anaconda for me is not the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock.
Yeah, but you could say, Beyonce's Lemonade is political, isn't it, in its own way, about feminism?
That's true. Beyonce is, I suppose, is probably the closest we have
and
to
yet
an artist
couldn't be more corporate, really, if she tried.
That's true. That
is
true.
Maybe it is possible to marry both things when you're a superstar.
It does maybe lack that kind of raw edge, though, because the young generation seem to be more conservative in their outlook, they're not conservative in their voting patterns at all. There is this big, fandom behind Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour movement generally, and then also,
no attendant rise in Chumbawamba back catalogue sales.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Maybe we'll start one. But and lots of interest in racial, gender issues, which Beyonce really tapped into with Lemonade. But there isn't necessarily that raw edge of making art that's maybe less glossy and less corporate. That does seem to have disappeared, the rawness.
I don't know if there's an element here, though, of us being just a bit nostalgic. There are bands who make political music, like Radiohead. Radiohead have made a career out of doing politicised music, and they're still doing it now. If you saw their Glastonbury set, there was a whole anti-Brexit Theresa thing in the middle of one of their songs. They just started sort of doing a chant at the end of one of their songs, and then thus inspired the now ubiquitous "Oh Jeremy Corbyn" chant in response. And I think that the Raw Edge stuff, some of the Jimi Hendrix. I mean, this was just the music was better, and we're talking about the artists that sort of survived the test of that time.
Hold on. I mean, this is an interesting discussion, but as I say, it's a separate discussion, isn't it? Why don't you hear political songs so much anymore? Is a separate discussion to if you're an established artist, why is it now okay to take the corporate dollar? Because I think we can agree that basically it is. Why has that changed?
I think it's just reality, isn't it? Isn't it just that people have accepted that unless, if we are going to live in the age where the internet makes everything fundamentally free, someone's got to pay for it somewhere. And we all buy brands, we all watch television, But
they're so easy. I mean, the example that sticks in my mind, because I thought it was hilarious, was the Sex Pistols, of course, was signed to Virgin Records. Now, admittedly, Virgin was a very different company in 1977 than it is today. But I think in 2015, Virgin Money launched some Sex Pistols branded credit cards. Because they still work with the brand.
Johnny Rotten himself advertises Country Life Butter.
He does. But I just thought that was, that's the perfect sort of exemplar of that journey, isn't it? It's now just perfectly acceptable to say, well, the Sex Pistols is a brand, Virgin is a brand, they work together. Everyone's happy to buy into anti-establishment as a brand. And that's how people have grown with it.
To start with, though, Malcolm McLaren made the Sex Pistols a brand. Like they were always a brand.
There's a difference between even if the artists themselves, in some of the artists in the countercultural movement, and then afterwards, and through the 70s, they themselves may have been working with companies and pushing their brands. I mean, obviously, artists are always going to be aware of their brands and their audiences, but I think the people at home who were listening to that music genuinely believed that they were listening to something that was, that went against the grain of society and that did have that kind of political power. And I think now, when you've got songs where artists just drop the names of brands all the time, the people listening aren't under any illusion that they're listening to art that's not been influenced by the corporate interest, and they also don't seem to really care.
I just think some of these things are just trappings of a genre. So when I was growing up, I listened to a lot of new metal music, as it was known, rap rock and all that sort of thing, and wore the nail varnish and all that sort of thing.
Did you?
I did, yeah. It was.
Give us some names. Limp Bizkit,
Marilyn Manson, Slipknot.
Yeah.
But there was a codification of what you did in those sectors, and there was a codification about the way these people went about their music. People might think of Slipknot as this sort of anti-establishment band, or Marilyn Manson as an anti-establishment figure. Actually, he conforms to a very generic set of principles about how he goes about his music, because that's what sells records. When he brought out Mechanical Animals, it was a very avant-garde album for him. It didn't talk an awful lot about religion. It didn't sell very well, so his next album was Holywood, which was all about Christianity and poking fun at the Catholic Church again. And suddenly he was selling records again. He sold out to his own fan base in a way. This idea that there's this great creativity in counterculture, it's actually, as much as anything, just a generic movement most of the time.
Are some partnerships just best avoided? I mean, U2 and Apple springs to mind. Do you remember when they put a free album on everyone?
I still have that.
That was so annoying, because I hadn't realised they'd done that, and I suddenly saw it on my phone. I thought, what on earth did I
Why did I buy a U2
Why
album?
did I buy U2?
Did anyone listen to it either? I mean, I've still got it on my iTunes, and I've never listened to it
I've
since.
still got it. I don't listen to it. It's just frustrating.
I mean, looking back on that, who do you think sold out, actually, out of U2 and Apple?
U2. Apple is a commercial machine, though, isn't it? Like, people accept that Apple is all about style, branding, and sales. U2, ostensibly as a rock band, were meant not to be about that. And Bono, as the great environmental campaigner, was meant to be about more than that.
Well, maybe that's part of the reason that we've come to this kind of situation now, is that
it's Bono's fault. That's a great way to end.
It's always Bono in this podcast. That Apple has in itself become this icon on the level of a musician or an actor or, a TV show. It has got its own following. So if brands are going to have the same following as artists, then why would young people care when they merge together?
Yeah, you see, that's fascinating, because if you think about Beats by Dre being bought by Apple, I'd say in that circumstance, it's harder to argue which of the two parties sold out, really. Like, that was kind of Apple selling out and admitting they couldn't make headphones that would sell as well as Dre selling out his image to Apple. Well, with that, we end another week of this excellent brand partnership between Olly Mann and The Week. Thank you very much to my guests, Rebecca Gillie, Felicity Capon and Ashley Wassall. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. You can download our free iPhone app. We're not selling out. It's called The Week Day. Or you can get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And remember, you can find every single episode of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. All you need to do is search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.